welcome to the Truth Exchange podcast, a unique program where we have conversations about worldview, all through the lens of oneism and twoism. This lens is based on Romans 1:25, where we've exchanged the truth of God for the lie, worship and serve creation, rather than the Creator who is blessed forevermore. I'm your host, Josh Ugilo, and today I have two special guests with me, Dr. Peter Jones. Welcome, Dr. Jones.
I'm glad to be with you.
And Dr. Stephen Shavura, who is a new guest. Welcome, Stephen.
Great to be here. Thanks, Josh.
Stephen holds a PhD in the history of early modern English political thought. He's published in a number of journals as well as author of several books. His research interests include the history of political thought, church and state in history, modern political philosophy, recognition theory, and freedom of speech. Stephen also regularly contributes to public debates in various online and print forum, as well as radio. Stephen also contributed to our recent symposium at the beginning of this year. Dr. Jones was ill, and so Stephen jumped in to our rescue and delivered Dr. Jones's lecture. This was the Mind of Christ, Taking Every Thought Captive. We have over the next few weeks some special speakers lined up because we are going to be addressing some key cultural hot topics, and it's going to be preparation for our 2021 online symposium, which is the state of our disunion. Dr. Jones, could you share a little bit about what the state of our disunion is?
Well, I don't think we've ever been more disunified, but it's over a whole series of issues that seem to be lining up one after the other. We are disunified as to how we should obey the government in terms of what it's saying about the lockdown, and some churches are going against local rules, and some churches will not do that. But there is an argument to be made, and we perhaps could talk about that. Then we're very much disunified over how to vote. Stephen doesn't know about this because he's in Australia, and they don't vote in Australia. They're still trying to become civilized people.
True, it's true. We're still ruled by governors. Still martial law here.
Founded as they were with a boatload of criminals.
Still are, that's correct. Only because you guys stopped taking them.
Well, the point is they were English criminals, though, so that saved you.
That's right, and it condemns you.
That's right. Anyway, the big question, which is coming up in 27 days in terms of voting, is to how Christians should vote. Mm-hmm. Should Christians vote for the Democrats or the Republicans, for Biden or for Trump? And there are a number of Christians who don't feel that they can vote for Trump. Mm-hmm. So there is a big division among Christians in our time. And then, of course, one of the subjects we'll be dealing with today is the massive cultural division that is taking place right now between those who are totally taken up by what's called critical race theory and those who do not believe that this is a correct thesis. But this is perhaps the most divisive because it's certainly going through the culture. And it's interesting to note that even the President, Donald Trump, has given laws or has told federal agencies and the military to stop teaching critical race theory, since it is undermining the confidence that young people have in the solidity of the American system. And so this is going through the culture like we probably didn't know was happening, but now discovering that it's going everywhere. And we perhaps should talk about that a little bit as well.
Mhm.
But it's not only in the culture, it's in the church, because it comes into the church as a theory that will determine how we relate to our fellow Christian brothers and sisters who are African American. And so this is a very divisive kind of an issue that we really need to talk about and think about and seek some kind of resolution. I may have missed other divisive things, guys. Can you think of anything else that we need to talk about?
Well, I mean, the divisions are also over how we respond to ecological issues, whether we're in the midst of an imminent global catastrophe or not. Obviously, there are also divisions over the nature of COVID and the seriousness of COVID. Yeah, I mean, the divisions run deep and they run wide. And it's hard to imagine a time in American history since the Civil War that Americans have been so deeply and widely divided.
Yeah, we will be for the lectures and the speakers. It's going to be the Great Awokening with Dr. Stephen Shavira, Cultural Marxism, Dr. Peter Jones. Stephen, you mentioned the Green Deal or climate change, global warming. So ecology and the Green New Deal by Dr. Cal Beisner. Gender and Anthropology with Mary Weller. Race with Mark Robinson. He's a pastor in the Reformed Presbyterian circles. Law and Policy with Dr. Jeffrey Ventrella. Spirituality with John Harris. And the issue of how to evangelize in this intense time of division with Dr. Thaddeus Williams. So let's back up now. Let's define some of these terms. We threw out, Dr. Jones, you threw out critical race theory. Stephen, your talk is on the Great Awokening. What does it mean to be woke? What is woke?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, the best, probably the most succinct definition of to be woke is to be aware or awake to all the systemic injustices that oppress certain people in society because, so the case goes, because our institutions and our social practices were invented by white heterosexual men for the benefit of white heterosexual men and only for white heterosexual men. And so to be woke is to understand that and then to start recognizing all the instances of sexism, homophobia, racism, and other sorts of isms and phobias in our public institutions, in our language, in our practices, and also, secondly, to essentially be an activist to overthrow all of that. And so in a sense, wokeness is a revolutionary agenda to try to eradicate traces of white male heterosexual domination in society.
Well, two things. Could you define what systemic means? And then can you be white and woke? Or are you not, are the three of us not allowed to be woke?
These are fantastic questions. I mean, first, yes, you can be white and woke. Now, systemic, I'll get back to that other one in a second. But systemic is actually, that's sort of the devil in the detail that woke theorists often find difficult to define. I suppose by systemic racism, what often race theorists, and Peter will talk more about this, I think, but what they basically mean is inequalities of outcome. So if in society you see that, say, people of color or African Americans, Hispanics are doing more poorly economically, in terms of health, in terms of educational attainments, in terms of career aspirations, then that is evidence of systemic racism. Now, but I still haven't quite answered your question. What do they mean by systemic? They basically mean, and it is kind of vague, that the rules of our public institutions, whether they're our law courts, whether it's the way we elect politicians, and also the rules of other institutions like educational institutions, the curricula that we study, and also our economic system, but also just the way we think about how a society ought to be run, our prevailing conceptions of justice, say that might be considered individualistic and based on individual hard work and striving.
I've got one. I've got one. The color of a Band-Aid.
The what, sorry?
The color of a Band-Aid.
The color of a Band-Aid. Did you want to elaborate on that?
You know, a Band-Aid in American language is what you put on a cut. And you buy those in the store, and the color of that Band-Aid is the color of a white man.
Mm-hmm. I just started seeing they're now coming in black.
Oh, have you seen that?
Yeah, I just saw that the other day. I was like, oh, they've got it's ethnical bandages.
That's right. Well,
yeah.
That's another sign of systemic, I suppose you could say.
Yeah, and the idea of systemic is that all of these institutions are essentially programmed in a way really solely to benefit white people, but in particular sort of white. It's pretty vague because you can ask to sort of be pointed to certain instances of systemic racism, and you might find references to police brutality. You might find references to inordinate numbers of African Americans being incarcerated. You might find references to white skin colored Band-Aids. But whether those are things that sort of are enough to say that the whole system of policing is racist, or our whole system of economics, our whole economic system is racist, that's quite another question. And so the term systemic is actually pretty vague. And this is something pointed out by many theorists. For example, let me ask you, I mean, the obvious question is, well, what do we mean by the system? I mean, to say that the economic system was designed, or the educational system, or the justice system or the political system were designed by white people for white people, well, that sort of assumes that that these systems have not evolved and changed over the last sort of couple of hundred years. So take our laws. It's very simplistic to say that the laws are simply for white males when, throughout the 50s, 60s and 70s, you had reforms in laws designed specifically to speak to the needs of African Americans, to speak to the needs of women and that kind of thing. And so the idea that the system is sexist or the system is racist kind of assumes that the system is ossified and hasn't really changed in 200 years. And that's just not true. So it's a very simplistic understanding of the term system. And when you use that simplistic understanding of the term system, then the idea of systemic racism sounds kind of plausible. But when you really start thinking about what the systems that we live under are like and how they've evolved over the years, then the claim that the system is vitiated by racism and needs to be overthrown loses a lot of its plausibility.
Is there any aspect or redemptive or any way to redeem some of these ideologies? Is there any aspect of this that falls under common grace?
We might be jumping ahead.
Okay.
With that question, I think.
Okay.
We'd better look first of all at the problems and the problematic issues that are being raised before we jump into how we can arrive at a redemptive view of things.
Okay, so let me backtrack then, and so this is open game for everyone. Black Lives Matter, pro-life, or cradle to grave pro-life, social justice. These are all aspects of being woke. Is that right, Stephen? Dr. Jones?
Dr. Jones, did you want to try this one?
Well, if it's a continuation of the question about woke, it seems to me, as I've been reading, that it is specifically whether we are aware of what you've been saying, that there is such a thing as a systemic anti-Black opinion of every white person, and that we cannot get out of that. We're condemned to be systemically racist just because of the color of our skin, which, as you say, seems extremely simplistic, as if skin color has so much to say, especially since there are so many different shades of skin color. What a crazy criterion for establishing such a massive accusation of systemic racism. Because, you know, Kamala Harris talks about being a Black woman, and there's nothing Black in her face at all. She's perfectly white. And I just wonder what this reference to Black actually means.
Mm.
That's a minor problem, I suppose, but it is part of this wokeness that we are supposed to understand that the Black race has been extremely badly treated, and it's the cause of white racism.
When I was at the General Assembly for the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, I think it was about 2016. I think you were there that year, Dr. Jones. That was the year when they did the whole report about racial reconciliation. And I went to a seminar, and in the seminar, the speaker said that white people have no idea what it's like to be treated under the oppression of racism. And I raised my hand because I'm Jewish, and I know what it's like as a Jew. I remember in junior high being picked on because I was Jewish. I was the funny looking kid with the kippah and the payets, you know. I stuck out like a sore thumb. And she says, no, that's not racism. And I thought, that's such a bizarre thing to say. That just because I'm white, my understanding of racism is not even comparative to the black person's experience. And I've often heard Black people say, white people will never know. And I've heard this also from Asian. White people will never know what it's like to tell their children when a police officer pulls you over how you're supposed to act. White people will never know what it's like to tell their children to, when you go to a grocery store, people are going to look at you funny if you're wearing a hoodie or if you have a backpack on. And I thought, that's totally not true, because I was told by my parents how to respond to a police officer when you're pulled over. That was even in driver's education. I was told when I go to a grocery store, you don't wear a hood over your head because you can look like you're a gangbanger. I was told don't go into the store with your backpack on because they're going to think you're stealing. Some of this is just this common sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is what some people are calling sort of ethnic or racial Gnosticism. The idea that, you know, a person from one race can't possibly understand what it's like to be a person from another race. And look, I'm sympathetic with that idea, but that's a far cry from saying that someone who's not an African American can't possibly understand what it's like to experience racism. They're two very different claims. So I would respond and say, well, and you know, a white Jewish person won't know what it's like to be an African American person experiencing racism, but an African-American non-Jewish person won't know what it's like to be a white Jewish person experiencing some form of sort of racial prejudice. Now, I grew up in a suburb of Sydney that's very, very multicultural. And where I grew up, it was a pretty, where I sort of went to school, caught the train, it was a pretty rough area. And I can tell you right now that on a daily basis, when I'd go to and from school, I felt very intimidated by people from other races. There were lots of gangs in the area, and on several occasions I was assaulted. I was called a white so-and-so. Now, would I call that racism? Well, yes, I would. I experienced, as a white young man, racism in my own sort of microclimate, if you like. So if someone said to me, you don't know what it's like to experience racism or to be discriminated against or to be hated because of your race, I would actually say, that's not true. I know exactly what that is like. Now, do I know what it's like to experience that as a black person in the way that a black person experiences it? No. But that's a far cry from saying that I've not experienced some form of genuine prejudice and even threat to my safety based on my race. Now, the way that sort of critical race theorists, like someone like Robin DiAngelo in her book White Fragility, the way they basically say that white people can't understand racism or cannot possibly experience racism is simply by redefining the term racism. So up until now, we've tended to define racism as an attitude or set of behaviors against someone else that either views them in a degraded way or treats them in a negative, discriminatory way based on their race, based on a contempt for their racial category. That's how we've tended to understand racism. Robin DiAngelo says, no, that's not racism, that's prejudice. She says racism is really something that characterizes a system, and the system is racist if under that system, certain people from certain races do better or worse than others. So a system is racist if in that society where that system exists, and again, the word system is used very simplistically and very vaguely as well here. If you have, say, African Americans who statistically are more likely to be poorer or less well educated, then that is because the system is racist. Now, the big question is, in some ways, why should we accept that definition of racist? Like, why should we just change the definition of racist? Because what that kind of neatly does is that it kind of, in her own words, it does kind of make it impossible for white people to be racist. But why should we accept that definition of racism? She never, ever tells us why we should accept her definition. In fact, in the book, she says, I'm not even going to try and prove it. I'm just going to assume that this definition of racism is the right one, and let's go from there. But she does admit that people of color, or African Americans and Hispanics, and that they can be prejudiced, which is what we used to call racist. So she kind of, all she really does is just change the lingo in order to place basically white people in a very invidious position to justify her social analysis that basically says the whole of society is skewed in the favor of white people. But there's just no reason to accept the definitions whatsoever. And she explicitly says she's not going to try to justify it at all. And that's why, Josh, you can go into a shop and you could have gone into a shop and be mocked for your race, be mocked for your religious clothing, and yet not be able to be the subject of racism. Yeah.
Okay.
If the system is white racism, how do you explain how Asians do much better than white people in America? They are much more well-educated, and they have higher incomes than white people. So if the
Indians do very well.
If the system was purely a structure of a synthesis of what's the word? White systemic racism.
Yeah.
Then that should have an effect on other races as well, but apparently it doesn't.
Well, we also know that Indians do quite well
That's right.
economically. You know,
Yeah.
so Indians, Asians, people that sort of classically thinking are not what we would call, you know, quote, white, unquote, that they do actually quite well as well. And so the problem is far more complex than these critical race theorists would suggest. And you won't be surprised that in Robin DiAngelo's book, she doesn't really address that in any depth whatsoever. In fact, one of the things that I was really surprised as I was reading Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, is that there's actually a name that one would have thought she would have mentioned in this book, talking about racist America, that is actually not mentioned once, and it is Barack Obama. This is a book on how racist America is, and you would think that at some point she would go into depth at how such a racist society would elect, why and how it would elect a black president, not once, but twice, who very often had very high approval ratings. You would think that there'd be a whole chapter on that, because you would think that that would falsify the idea that America is deeply systemically racist.
Right.
In actual fact, his name is never mentioned in the book, and there are, I think, about 2 very passing references to the president of America being black, but no really in-depth attempt to come to grips with the fact that Americans, who apparently are systemically vitiated with racism, elected Barack Obama not once but twice.
So this is clearly a system that is being constructed. In your reading of that book, did she use the term critical race theory at all?
I can't remember if she used the word critical race theory, but the book is most definitely critical race theory, Peter. And that's something I believe you've written about and done some research in.
Peter, do you want to introduce that a little bit? What is critical race theory?
Well, it's thinking that claims to be critical or intellectual. And there's a whole book on it that I have read. It's tough going, this book, but it's called Cynical Theories, and critical is crossed out, but it's an examination of critical race theory as a hermeneutic that allows people to establish really white supremacy. So it's, if you like, the tool whereby white supremacy is established by this logical, no, it's not very logical, but by this intellectual approach to theorizing about race. And this book by James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose tries to show that critical race theory came about through what I call neo-Marxism or cultural Marxism. They were the first ones to develop this, as a matter of fact. And that's why we can hook cultural Marxism into critical race theory, it seems to me, because it was invented by these cultural Marxists. And it is a system that, at the same time, actually criticizes the old Marxism, which was a thoroughly secular humanism, by the use, this gets awfully complicated, by the use of postmodern hermeneutics. Postmodern hermeneutics, I'll take it slowly. Postmodern hermeneutics actually states that there is no such thing as truth,
Right.
of an objective nature. So there are no major descriptions of the world that can stand up and claim to be true, because all truth is, as they say, socially generated. That is created by people who use language and who use it to establish their own power. So postmodernism is a theory of language as a source of power, but it's not a source of objective truth. And that has been the way in which critical race theory has imposed itself on the Western world, because it then says, if you argue against what we are saying in our critical race theory, you're using your own language, which is not true. So you have no access to truth, only your own power that you try to impose on me as a Black thinking person.
Yeah.
And
That, yeah.
And the
That's actually,
point I was wanting to make, though, is that postmodernism was a fundamental critique of secular humanism. You know, it wasn't just a critique of Christian thinking or various philosophies of a religious nature. It was a critique of secular humanism thinking as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's why they say that Marxism was pulled down. But it's the neo-Marxists that reestablish the kind of thinking parallel to the old Marxism. But I think it's important to see that this kind of thinking, which denies absolute truth, tries to use truth as a power tool, but denies absolute truth. That's what I would say. It is a oneist system, rejecting any kind of notion of God as the source of truth, and thus of the truth of twoism. And it opens the door to what I've been talking about, which is the post-secular era. The post-secular era, and I hadn't seen this when I was first talking about the post-secular era, is the era where the old secular humanists, the atheists, are rejected, and the new secular humanists actually allow for various kinds of religion to survive, and they try to put the world together in a post-secular way by using various forms of the old spirituality that the secular humanists had rejected as superstition.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we have a culture that builds on the intelligence, as I like to say, of the old secular humanists, and puts together a world that allows into it these various religious systems like Hermeticism and Gnosticism and Buddhism and Hinduism and so on. The one religion they do not allow is twoist Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Peter, if I could summarize what you've just said, Marxism flattens and subverts economically.
Right.
Cultural Marxism flattens and subverts authority.
I suppose you could say that.
And then the post-secular nature of cultural Marxism, critical race theory, is this monistic aspect that flattens spirituality and unifies.
But it allows it in as one possible way of describing the world. So it brings in pagan spirituality again onto the scene. I think we're going to have to wait to see that flower, because we've always thought of Marxism as totally non-spiritual. But I'm beginning to wonder if neo-Marxism is not now moving into a much more spiritual way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Can I
It's
just
all
say,
complicated.
yeah, I agree with all of that, Peter, and I think that it's probably worth pointing out that there is this debate over whether cultural Marxism is really exists or if it's just some sort of right-wing conspiracy. You've probably all heard this accusation that cultural Marxism doesn't really exist. It's just something created by right-wingers and has a touch of anti-Semitism about it, and it's just created by right-wingers purely to discredit people on the left who might advocate various forms of social justice. The term cultural Marxism was not a term that was invented by people on the right. The term cultural Marxism was invented, or at least it seems first to have been used in the earlier 1970s, and it was used also throughout the 1980s by what we would call critical Marxist theorists of culture. It's actually a term invented by what we would call Marxists themselves. And people who are more conservative noticed the term, picked up on it, and then started using it. But you cannot deny that there has been a school of academic thought that has called itself cultural Marxism, and essentially what it was what Peter said that it was. It was taking the Marxist category of society as simply a struggle between the oppressed and the oppressor, and taking that beyond the economic realm and applying it to other forms of oppression, whether that's gender, whether it's sexuality, whether it's race. No one really denies that happened in academia. That happened, and it's well documented. And the question really is that way of thinking still influential today? And is it still okay to call it cultural Marxism? And I would say, to the first question, is that way of thinking still prevalent today? I would say most definitely yes. And should we still call it cultural Marxism? I would say, as long as we do so carefully, yes, we can still use that term. Anyone who says that cultural Marxism is not a thing, or that it's merely a conspiracy, really is wrong, and really doesn't understand that this particular mindset was and is very common in universities, particularly from the 1960s onwards.
I think
I would like to add to that something objective, and you no doubt know it anyway, but the cultural Marxism began with the establishment of the Frankfurt School, which was inspired by what was his name? Gramsci, the Italian Marxist Gramsci.
Where is the Frankfurt School, Peter?
The Frankfurt School was about half a dozen German Marxists who escaped. I think most of them were Jews as well, Josh, just for your encouragement, who escaped Nazi Germany in the 30s and came to America and were established as a teaching element at Columbia University. And they were invited by John Dewey.
Mm-hmm.
This is all very interesting because John Dewey was raised as a Reformed Christian believer. Mm. And he rejected that, and he rejected the notion of God as the source of existence, and developed a theory of teaching that wanted to make the case that human beings invent their own reality. Mm. And this was in the 30s.
That's
He actually went to Russia, and he admired the Russian system. And then later on, he founded the training school at Columbia University for the training of teachers, based on this denial of God the Creator and a sort of Marxism that he had actually observed both in his reading, but also going over and being with Lenin in Moscow. So here is a deep connection between what becomes neo-Marxism or cultural Marxism, developed by these Jewish Marxist scholars following Gramsci. Now, what does Gramsci have to say? Gramsci said we should ditch the notion of revolution as a sort of a physical rejection of the power of the state, and undermine the state via an examination of all the philosophical notions of the West and undermine them. And that's precisely what the Frankfurt School did, hooking up with, of course, later with the 60s revolution. So this fits. Marcuse and read Rudy Duschke, who was a 60s revolutionary, agreed with him that the revolutionaries of the 60s needed to go underground and make the long march through the institutions. And this is precisely what Marcuse, one of the Frankfurt School scholars, agreed with. And so he came and taught a total undermining of Western sexuality. Eros and Civilization was one of his books. And I heard him speaking at Princeton when I was there. Mm-hmm. But he was a massively popular scholar. But of course, he fitted in with the 60s revolution in its rejection of classic sexuality. And so you have a new form of revolution which does not seek to overturn the actual physical structures, but seeks to overturn the fundamental defining notions of the culture, like sexuality and like, you know, the notions of fair play and the Constitution, gender, things race, like that.
Nature,
so
yeah.
It's definitely all tied together, it seems to me. Mm-hmm. That we do have cultural Marxism flowing out of Marxism, but it's new, as Stephen said, because it is not simply tied to material things or economics, but to all the elements of Western civilization being overturned.
But just in terms of continuity with Marxism, we also want to be careful about exaggerating the extent to which that cultural Marxism or sort of critical theory have sort of broken away from classical Marxism. Because even in sort of Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility and Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, you know, they both still essentially argue that the reason racism exists is because historically it served capitalistic purposes. So, you know, why did we invent race and therefore racism? Well, essentially to justify slavery. And why do we want slavery? The capitalists wanted slavery. So we also want to remember that even this sort of critical theory, which does apply Marx's analysis more broadly to the economy, still maintains that at the end of the day, the reason we have these modes of oppression ultimately is because in some way they serve the capitalist order. So it's still quite Marxist in its analysis. And Black Lives Matter is a great example. Black Lives Matter talks almost as much about capitalism as it does about racism. And Black Lives Matter, so to get to an earlier question of yours, Joshua, is definitely it's sort of the example, the exemplar of wokeness, because Black Lives Matter basically looks around society and says the whole thing needs to be pulled down, the system needs to be pulled down. And when you went to their website a few months ago, you would see that it's not just racism that needs to be pulled down. You would see that it was heteronormativity, so that heterosexuality as the norm, that needs to be pulled down.
Nuclear family.
The nuclear family, well, they've taken that off now,
Yeah.
Joshua. You'd be aware of that, yeah. But they've taken that down because obviously, probably because that proved far too controversial, probably among African Americans who, in terms of their social ideals, tend to be actually much more conservative than whites. But yeah, they said, you know, what used to be on the Black Lives Matter website is that we want to disrupt the traditional nuclear family and basically implement newer forms of family. Certainly, it was against gender binary ideas that you've just got male and female. It was very pro-transgender. And so Black Lives Matter was the sort of the epitome of wokeness that basically looked around society and saw all of our systems, the ways that we think, which is what Peter was getting at earlier, the ways that we think, the ways that we speak, the ways that we live, as essentially the creation of white heterosexual males, and essentially the whole thing needed to be torn down and rebuilt anew.
That's right. Black Lives Matter, as you remember, also boasts of being Marxist trained.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, Black Lives Matter spokespeople in the past, and it's all on YouTube, have spoken about how racism is caused by capitalism, how we need to overthrow capitalism. And yeah, one of the co-founders recently said, yeah, we're trained Marxists.
But also spirituality, because they have sought a relationship with Black paganism in Africa and development of a sort of a worship of witchcraft. So that this is a much more subtle form than most people understand. When I see all the football teams, that soccer teams in England, taking the knee on every game because of Black Lives Matter, I realize how powerful this movement is. But most people don't know some of the things that you mentioned, Stephen, or this relationship to Black ancient pagan spirituality.
Gents, we have to.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Okay. I was just going to say, I think one of the problems that we need to really address as Christians, and really just as anyone who wants to critique wokeness, is that increasingly the whole vocabulary and sort of way of thinking about genuine problems like racism, the way of thinking about it and the way of speaking about it is more and more being exhausted by wokeness. That is, we're getting to the point where where everything we hear about in terms of the problems of racism is from a woke critical theory lens. And so the problem with that is that people who instinctively feel that there's something wrong with wokeness, that there's something wrong with critical theory, but can't quite put their fingers on it, it's gotten to the point where people like that are basically in a position where they either reject wokeness and therefore can almost no longer condemn racism, because the only way you can condemn it now is via wokeness, or reluctantly start experimenting with woke and critical theory ways of thinking about the world, and that leads them down a really dark, conflict-ridden track. And so I think what we need to do is regain a biblical understanding of justice and injustice.
This conflict is irredeemable. You cannot fix it. That's one of the worst things. One thing I found too, in the light of this Black Lives Matter and wokeness and its impact on our culture, is the division it is creating in the church and in the culture. And that this was attempted 70 years ago also by Marxists. And the goal was to revive amongst Black people an anger with their treatment and create a movement to critique America as being hopelessly racist. And this was tried 70 years ago. And now we have it in our time, the exact same methodology trying to undermine the confidence that citizens have in the system that we live in because it is so hopelessly racist. Now, 70 years ago, it was a lot easier to do it. But now, of course, as you suggest, even with all the changes we've gone through, including the civil rights actions and so on, we're seeing that this is a phony attempt to undermine the confidence that Americans have in their system. But this has been going on for a number of years. And what we're seeing in the streets today is merely a very small expression of what many Americans have been taught to think. And one of the ways that this has happened is the training for generations of Americans about their own culture using the book by Howard Zinn, A Popular History of America, which was written, he was a convinced Marxist.
Yes, it sells 100,000 copies a year.
No, it's also the fact that his book is the only one in many schools that's used as a history book. And he has created a few generations of Americans that are dissatisfied with the American system and believe it is evil, and we have to change it. So what we see in the streets is only a minor expression of a progressive movement that I believe is massive.
I agree. I completely agree. And Howard Zinn's book, The People's History of America, it sells 100,000 copies a year. I think it's hard to overestimate the impact that has had on the minds of millions of children and young adults who have basically been taught that everything in American history is just one oppressive event or oppressive person after another. Can I just say one last thing for myself, and that is it could be worth exploring in a sense, to sort of go back to something you said earlier, Peter, about how a lot of these sort of the irredeemable aspect of a lot of woke theory. It seems to me the key place where wokeness goes wrong, there are a few, but one of them is that in most woke literature, you will find pretty much no references to forgiveness. So you're not going to find references to forgiveness in White Fragility, for example. You'll find sort of references to reconciliation and things like that, but it's almost as though woke theory sort of aspires to a kind of reconciliation or restitution without forgiveness. And the problem with that is, I think that there are these times in life when we as individuals or as groups of people cry out to God because of an injustice that's occurred. Obviously, in the example of Jews, it would be the Holocaust. For the example of African Americans, it would be slavery. We cry out to God and ask, where is justice? Happens in people's individual lives. Let's say a family member is unjustly killed or maimed by someone else. But I think what we also learn is that it's precisely those moments when we cry out for justice that in actual fact is unattainable in this life. In all those moments when we are so aggrieved and injured that we cry out for justice, these generally are precisely the times where we cannot have it, not in this life. And the problem with wokeness ideology is that when you get rid of forgiveness, what you have is this strong call for justice, this strong call for restitution, even calls for repentance, with the expectation that at some point there will be some kind of reconciliation. But the problem is that there's never ever going to be proper justice for the sin of slavery. It's never going to happen. And the problem is that in any ideology that looks for social wholeness or social reconciliation without prioritizing forgiveness, all you will ever wind up with is conflict. All you will ever wind up with is a feeling among one party that I'm really, really sorry for what I have done and what has happened in the past. I'm really, really sorry. And a feeling among another party that I have been really injured by this. My ancestors have been really, really injured by this. But that can never, ever be bridged without forgiveness. And so what you're left with is a group of people who feel that they're really, really sorry, but don't feel like that's being adequately recognized. And another group of people who feel really aggrieved and injured and don't ever feel whole. And so all you're going to wind up with in the long term is conflict. And that's precisely what has broken out on the streets of America. And when you have a conception of justice, when you have a conception of reconciliation without prioritizing forgiveness as you have in the gospel, that is sort of notions of justice and reconciliation in a post-Christian world, in fact, all you will ever wind up with is conflict. And that's precisely what the moment we're living through right now.
That's right. And this is a dangerous time for that reason. I appreciate that emphasis because it makes so much sense. But I read yesterday someone saying we're very close to civil war.
That's a scary thought. I definitely think that America is on the brink of prolonged armed conflict. Maybe the best analogy I could think of would be like the Troubles between Ireland and the rest of Britain in the 70s and 80s. That would be the best analogy I could think of. To be frank, I think if Trump wins in November, I think America will immediately descend into armed conflict. I think that's inevitable. I think if Trump loses, it will probably still happen, but it'll take a bit longer. Maybe not.
We have to wrap up. Our time is up, but I do want to go back a little bit, tease out, Stephen, your last piece there about there being no forgiveness in this woke ideology. Is there anything redeemable out of woke culture? Is there any aspect that plays into common grace?
Yeah.
Because I see a number of Christians whom would be very much on an orthodox and confessional level really embrace this, really feel that they see these problems in society, and they have championed woke ideology, championed the Black Lives Matter, championed the social justice, and they'll say this is Christian liberty. So how does common grace fit into all this? Is there an aspect of common grace on this system?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of any redeeming elements of wokist ideology, I mean, wokist ideology certainly values some form of justice. It certainly aspires to some kind of equality. I would actually say that the redeeming aspects of woke ideology are probably a legacy of historical Christianity. And I think that's probably because wokist ideology itself is part of the evolving history of Marxism. And Marxism is in some ways best understood as a bizarre expression of Christianity with its own creation, fall, redemption narrative. And so to the extent that wokeism says that people ought to be treated fairly, that all people have dignity, and that a society that does not treat all people with equal dignity is a society that needs reform, I would say to that extent, certainly wokist ideology has true elements to it. But the problem is always, the problem is always that the lies are actually very subtle. And so in the context of wokist ideology, where it tends to go wrong is that it will talk about sin, but it won't talk about sin as a universal affliction that vitiates all human beings. Mm-hmm. They'll talk about it as mainly something that vitiates white heterosexual males. And the problem with that is once you get rid of the Christian understanding of sin as something that vitiates everyone, and therefore everyone needs redemption, and no one can point to another person and say sinner, without pointing to themselves back and thus be humbled. When you get rid of that and you have a sort of wokest emphasis on sort of tribal sins, that my tribe is sort of the sinned against and your tribe is the sinner, then again, what you wind up with is conflict. And so to Christians, what I would say is certainly be concerned about the existence of racism in the same way that you should be concerned about the existence of poverty, but also about the existence of murder in all its forms, not just murdering autonomous adults, but murdering children in the womb. But at the same time, you've got to think about it properly. You've got to really try to have a constructive and realistic understanding about what racism is, what the causes of present day inequalities are. And the problem with wokeism is that for almost every explanation it offers, it either outright just denies the facts. So, for example, it might talk about a sort of a gross number of police killings of African Americans, and almost a sort of, I mean, the Black Lives Matter website talks about sort of almost genocide against African Americans by police and by white people, which is just a lie. It is just a lie. It is not true. Or what it often does is it relies on vague or very simplistic notions like systemic racism, which we've spoken about earlier. So to Christians who sort of are confronted with claims of wokeism, you want to learn to remain concerned about racism and various forms of inequality, but not buy into the wokest solution or the wokest or the critical theory analysis of it, because the critical theory analysis of it is wrong, it's simplistic, and it's going to be immiserating for society as a whole. And we're seeing that right now.
Mm-hmm. I would like to say too, Josh, forgiveness is not common grace, it's special grace. And I fear that the woke solution is not a solution even of common grace, because it promotes victimization. That's one of the worst kind of situations in which a human being can place him or herself. So I do believe we need grace. We need common grace, but I think that is all involved in the structure of minority homes and the rejection of victimization and so on. That's common grace, but we do need special grace, which is the gospel of forgiveness.
Yes.
And that's a fine way to end this episode. This concludes our episode of the Truth Exchange Podcast, a unique program where we have conversations about worldview, all through the lens of oneism and twoism. Be sure to drop us a line, let us know how you think we're doing, or let us know about anything that you would like to see us address in upcoming episodes. Remember, this podcast is only made possible from friends like you.